Hi everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to tell you about the evolution of birds. I thought I'd begin by sharing this wonderful illustration with you of a Jurassic scene. And it's really quite a wonderful scene because it gives us an idea about what were the contemporary animals around at the time. So right in the foreground you can see there are tiny rodent-like animals which are mammals. And at the same time, there were also dinosaurs around. In the water, there were various fish, there were various reptiles, turtles, frogs. And in the skies, there were birds, and there were also pterosaurs, which are the flying reptiles. The world was very different at this time. And I hope that in this talk, you'll realize how birds evolved and also how flight evolved. So the structure of the talk is going to be in 5 different sections. I will begin by talking about the diversification of modern birds. We'll then talk about the origin of birds and then move on to talk about evolution of flight, and then color preservation in fossil feathers. And lastly, I will touch on some of my research on early bird bone histology. So this study, published just a few weeks ago in fact, is by Heiner Kuhl and his colleagues, and it is the most current up-to-date phylogenetic relationships of modern birds. As you can see, the 7 major clades of birds are indicated on the extreme right, and in bold black letters are the divergent times for the different forms. And it's very clear that the earliest divergence was between the paleognates and the neognates, which occurred probably about 94 million years ago. And thereafter you see that a number of these other major lineages actually diversify. Many of them actually diversify, as you can see, before the end of the Cretaceous extinction event, which occurred about 65 million years ago. And what's also interesting is that the most recent diversification is the Australaves, which are the passerines and the parrots and hawks. So that's quite interesting. This chart actually shows a much simplified version of the previous one. It's actually a little bit older, but the essence of the explanations are still there. So again, the point is here, the dotted lines indicate that many of these modern birds, the neornithines, arose in the Cretaceous, well before the Cretaceous tertiary extinction event. And the other important point is that if you follow that line down from the neornithines right up to aves, you'll see that this is where birds begin, or the radiation of birds begin. And the point is that between aves and Archaeopteryx, indicated at 150 million years, and the neornithines, there are a range of other forms that actually evolved. And we have a really good understanding of the diversity of birds that originated before we actually get to modern birds. So this is really quite interesting in itself. And the other important point is that after the Cretaceous tertiary extinction event, that is that red line, you see that the radiation of most of the major lineages that we have today actually begins. And in some cases, we see that the second major diversification of modern birds actually happens in the Miocene, but they actually do evolve early on in the Paleocene and even earlier in the Cretaceous. So the first indication of fossils of birds began in 1860 when a single fossil feather was discovered in a locality called Sollenhofen in Germany. It immediately led to the understanding that birds were around 150 million years ago. Soon thereafter, a body fossil with feather impressions was discovered, and subsequently at least 12 specimens of Archaeopteryx, as it became known, was discovered, all of them from the Sollenhofen locality, and some of them as recently as 2014. Here's a specimen of Archaeopteryx showing the beautiful skeletal preservation and the wonderful feathered wings that are also preserved. And for all the bird enthusiasts out there, you probably already noticed that the anomaly with the specimen is that it has a long bony tail. So you can see here where the arrow is pointing, there is a long bony tail. Modern birds don't have this. What they have is a fused tailbone called the pygostyle. But here we see Archaeopteryx actually retains the dinosaur feature of a long bony tail, as you can see in the reconstruction as well. So when Archaeopteryx was discovered, people immediately realized that it fell somewhere in between reptiles and birds. It had many features that were reptile-like and many features that were bird-like, and it clearly was a transitional form. The question then became, what animal among the reptiles were the ancestors of birds? And there were many different hypotheses that were proposed. The very first one was by Thomas Huxley in 1860, where he suggested that dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds. And he based this by comparing modern terrestrial birds with dinosaurs. Subsequently, there was another hypothesis that proposed that crocodiles were the ancestors of birds. And then in the 1970s, John Ostrom from Yale University proposed that dinosaurs were the ancestors of birds. And the most recent hypothesis was one that suggested that an archosaur called Protoavis was the ancestor of birds. Today, we have much consensus that suggests that theropod dinosaurs are the reptiles to which Archaeopteryx is most closely related to, and of course birds on the other hand. So Archaeopteryx is this transitional animal that has mosaic features that are bird-like and theropod dinosaur-like. So some of the features that make it theropod-like are things in its skull anatomy, so in the cranial anatomy, the actual structure of the forelimbs, the long bony tail that we spoke about. It also has teeth in its jaws that are similar to the theropod dinosaurs. And of course, it also has feathers like some dinosaurs, which we'll chat about in the next few minutes. And it also does not have an ossified sternum. Bird features that Archaeopteryx has, at the time, feathers were only known in birds, so no feathered dinosaurs were known. So immediately when people saw the feathers in Archaeopteryx, they allied it immediately with birds. The length of its arms, so it had these long forelimbs that indicated it had a wing. It had fused clavicles, it had a pelvic structure like modern birds, and also the hind limb structure was like that of modern birds. So it clearly was an animal that fell smack in between meat-eating dinosaurs and birds. So if you look at a larger cladogram, so again the red line here indicates the end of the Cretaceous extinction event, And what we have here is basically dinosaurs indicated or here circled in blue. And we see dinosaurs, of course, are part of the archosaurs, which are part of the diapsids, which are part of the ammonites, of course, which are also tetrapods. But what is interesting is that if we look at the Dinosauria, we see that in the evolution of the dinosaurs, particularly the theropod dinosaurs, we see there is the acquisition of a number of features that actually lead up to birds. So you can see the development of the hinge-like ankle, the development of the feathers, the bipedal posture, the development of the fused wishbone, the feathers that develop, wings that form, the pygostyle. One can actually track how these different changes actually occurred in the evolution of these theropod dinosaurs. And this is just a very, very simplified indication of just 3 features, where we can see in the basal theropods there is this triradiate pelvic girdle with the pubic bone facing forward, and then in the more derived dinosaurs the pubis moves towards the back, and in modern birds the pubis faces completely back, and Archaeopteryx has an intermediate position. And the same applies with the wrist and the hand. We see that there's an increasing fusion in the number of wrist bones as we move towards birds, and in Archaeopteryx it's again an intermediate position, and with the clavicles we have the same situation. So the interesting thing is that when we look at cladistic analysis, we know that Archaeopteryx falls well within the Microraptoran dinosaurs. So this is the very derived group of dinosaurs. And if you look at this chart, we see that Archaeopteryx and aves, all of aves, are sister taxa to the Dinocosauria, which is the dromaeosaurids and the troodontids. And these lineages are really so similar to one another, and it's actually very difficult to tell them apart. There are many, many features that are shared between these groups. And even in the evolution of the Microraptorans, we see many features that actually are very bird-like in themselves. This chart shows us Archaeopteryx, and all these other birds are ones that actually are basal birds. So they actually, here we have the neornithines, the modern birds, right at the bottom, and all these others, there's more than 50 of them, that are actually basal birds. Many of these fossils have been discovered in the wonderful localities in China, but of course some of them come from elsewhere in the world. From Africa we have, from Madagascar we have Verona, which is an enantiornithine bird, and it's actually an interesting bird. We have other very, very interesting specimens of dinosaurs from Africa, but unfortunately not many birds. So that is a problem for Africa, is that we don't have deposits that preserve these delicate bones of birds. So if we now move on to talk about the evolution of flight, there have been, until recently, 2 main prevailing hypotheses. The first was trees downwards, which suggested that the ancestor of birds was arboreal and that it probably used its wings to glide from tree to tree. And the other hypothesis was the grounds upward hypothesis, which suggested the dinosaurs were the ancestors of birds and dinosaurs were terrestrial, and that dinosaurs increasingly used their arms to hop about, and finally they lengthened their arms and wings developed, and they then were able to fly. And these two hypotheses prevailed for a long time. But today we know that this story is much more complicated, and this dichotomy of trees downwards or ground upwards is really not true. And one of the major reasons for our understanding of dinosaur flight is actually the origin of feathers in dinosaurs. So the first discovery of feathers in dinosaurs was very recently. It was only in about 1995 when the specimen of Sinosauropteryx was announced to the world, where instead of the typical reptilian bony scutes that would form on its body, so the integument, instead of being reptile scaly skin, it actually had these fine projections all along the dorsal part of the body. The arrow is pointing there, and here on the other picture you can see these fine feather-like structures. And this reinforced the hypothesis that dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds. Since then, there have been many other dinosaurs that have been discovered that have feathers. Some of them, like this beautiful Archaeopteryx seen here, we see that this specimen also is very beautifully preserved with the bony skeletal material, and under UV light you can see the feather-like structures that are also preserved all along the body as well. And what's interesting is that this animal is actually one that had very short limbs, so it wasn't capable of flight, but it clearly had feathers that were present, and this basically led to the hypothesis that feathers actually first evolved in dinosaurs for insulation and maybe for sexual selection, and that only later they became co-opted as flight, for flight. And this is just to give you an idea of some of the beautiful preservation from these Chinese specimens that are just really absolutely wonderful. And then, of course, feathered dinosaurs were increasingly becoming known. And then there was this incredible discovery made, I think it was 2004, where a dinosaur was discovered with wings on its forelimbs and wings on its hind limbs, and it was called Microraptor gui. And you see very clearly it's different from birds, which only have feathers on its forelimbs, and here we had an animal that had both wings on its forelimbs and its hind limbs. And this specimen was beautifully preserved, so there was no mistaking it for anything else. It made front cover of Nature, and it clearly showed that we had an animal that was flying, but using a completely different mechanism for flying. And when the specimen was discovered, people also realized that as early as 1915, Beebe had proposed a hypothesis that modern birds actually went through a stage of 4 wings in the evolution of flight. But of course, nobody had paid any attention to that, and it really became lost in the literature. But with the discovery of Microraptor, it certainly brought attention to this very early hypothesis. So the question was then, did birds really go through a 4-wing stage of flight? Here's a close-up of the feathers in Microraptor, and you can see again really beautifully preserved specimens. And subsequently, I had the good fortune in 2014 to be part of a team that described another four-winged dinosaur called Changuraptor. And this was really one of the largest microraptoroids dinosaurs that are known. And it had a very long tail. The tail itself was about 30 centimeters long. And it's really, again, another beautiful specimen with clearly forelimb and hindlimb feathers. And another wonderful example of feather preservation is in the specimens that are discovered, several specimens now that have been discovered in Ember from Myanmar, so the Burmese Ember specimens. And here you see a really beautiful specimen of an Ancionus juvenile, and the feathers are preserved beautifully, as well as the actual integument, and you can see detail of claw preservation, everything. It's just astoundingly beautiful. So what also come out of all these studies of these dinosaurs with feathers is that there are many different kinds of feathers which we call morphotypes. So there's at least about 5 different kinds of feathers. And when we look at these feathers, we see that there are some dinosaurs completely unrelated to birds, like the ornithischians, which have these very fiber-like kind of feathers, filamentous kind of feathers. But as you go more towards birds, which is on the top of this cladogram, we see that you have an increasing suite of feathers that are more and more bird-like. So the different kinds of dinosaurs have different kinds of feathers, but as we get closer and closer to birds, we see there's overlap in the kinds of feathers that are present. And the typical pennaceous feather that develops is actually found very far up on the Menoraptoran clade. So if you look here, we see this is where you have pennaceous feathers developing, and we see clearly, oops, I just spotted a spelling error, there should be an E there. We see that this is where you get these derived asymmetrical feathers that you typically get in modern birds. And the other interesting thing is that over the past few years, literally from 2006 onwards, there have been the discovery of small arboreal dinosaurs that we basically put into a group called the Archaeopteryx, which are these wonderful dinosaurs that are preserved with membranous wings. So they are bat-like dinosaurs, and they also have feather-like structures on their body. So really, really absolutely wonderful specimens. And this dinosaur, Hichi, is the first one that was actually that had beautifully preserved specimen. And then next amongst these in terms of preservation, or the one that even surpasses Hichi, is the one discovered in 2019. So just last year, this Archaeopteryx specimen was found. And what all these specimens show is that these Archaeopterygidae are the closest sister taxa to modern birds. So they even are very, very derived dinosaurs. So they are dinosaurs with membranous wings, but they are incredibly close to modern birds. And this is Archaeopteryx. You can see again a beautiful specimen. One of the major things that is different from pterosaurs and even from bats is the fact that it has this styliform process that projects out of its wrist. But in terms of other features in its skeleton, its anatomy suggests that it's extremely bird-like. And they were also very, very small. And there's a wonderful reconstruction of Archaeopteryx. And what all of this has led to is a better understanding of how flight actually evolved. So we see that we've had the flight where we had dinosaurs that had feathers that were unable to fly, but we've also had feathered dinosaurs that were capable of flight. We've also seen the four-winged dinosaurs, and we also have these Scansoriopterigids, which also were capable of flight. So it seems that in the many Raptoran dinosaurs, flight evolved multiple times. And if we focus on this green box here, the next slide is a bit more complicated, but it gives more detail about this. And this is a paper that has been published really very, very recently by Pai et al. In 2020, so very, very new paper. And they basically they re-examine all these new specimens that have been discovered of feathered dinosaurs, and they examine their wings. They look at wing loading by looking at the wing area and the powered flight potential, the body mass of these different animals, and they figured out that the potential for power flight basically developed in a number of these taxa. Okay, all that is indicated in green is the organisms that have the potential for powered flight. And it is very clear from this that flight is not unique to birds, that if we look at the par aves, the very, very derived dinosaurs like the Dinocosauria, the Dromornithidae, we see that these dinosaurs, amongst them, we also have the development of flight. Okay, so you see here there are Microraptors there, Changuraptors there, and we also see that, of course, among the basal birds, so even among, here's Archaeopteryx, but even in early birds, we think that the potential for flight actually developed, and many of their forelimbs actually were able to have an aerofoil that allowed them to fly. So it seems that there were different types of flight that actually developed. And the big question is, why? Why did flight actually develop? Why was it at this time that all these derived dinosaurs were experimenting with flight? The answer is not very clear, but it may be that these small agile dinosaurs may actually have just been exploiting another ecological niche that was available at the time. It's really not clear what the reason for this is or why they were driven to it, but being small certainly helped, and having feather-like structures and forelimbs that were able to create an airfoil that allowed them to have lift enable flight. And it's just absolutely astounding to see that, you know, how our understanding of the evolution of flight has changed in just these past 10 years. Another interesting thing that has happened over the past 10 years is the fact that we now have a better understanding of the color of dinosaurs. And this means including birds as well. So in feathers, there are these structures that are called melanosomes that bear pigment. So they're basically the pigment-bearing organelles that are found in feathers. And there are some that are long cylindrical feathers, structures, organelles, and these cylindrical ones actually have pigment that is black and gray. So they have eomelanin that gives the black and gray color to feathers. And they are round spherical organelles that have pheomelanin that gives reddish, brown, and yellow color to feathers. In 2010, the melanosomes were basically identified and sampled in Sinosauropteryx, that is the first dinosaur where the feather structures were preserved, and they've sampled melanosomes in various parts of the specimen, and eventually they were able to analyze the pigment preserved inside those organelles, and they were able to, for the very first time, reconstruct what the color of these dinosaurs were like. And subsequently, there was another study that examined Ancionus, which is one of these very derived non-avian dinosaurs that sometimes actually in cladistic analysis comes out as a basal bird as well. So it's very, very derived, very close to birds. And melanosomes have also been examined in this animal, and its coloration appears to be as indicated. So since then, there have been many, many dinosaurs that have been studied, the melanosomes studied, to give us an indication of the color. And now that I have some time, I thought I'll tell you briefly about some of my work on bone microstructure. So one of the things that not many people realize is that even after millions of years of fossilization, the microscopic structure of bones are preserved. And what you have here is an example of a dinosaur that is 190 million years old, and as you can see, it's comparable with any modern animal, any modern bone of any modern animal. And I have a whole book, if you're interested, to read about the microstructure of dinosaur bone, because it gives us so much of information about how bones are formed, that is the rate at which bones formed. It tells us about age, so that's what ontogeny means. It gives us an indication of how animals grow. It tells us about when sexual maturity occurs. You can work out biomechanical function, you can assess disease. So it's really a powerful tool to understand paleobiology. And I've worked on many dinosaurs as well as on early birds. In fact, I've worked on so many different early birds, but today I thought I'll focus on Confuciusornis sanctus, which is my most recent study of a basal bird. And this animal is known from the Geol group in northeastern China, and it dates to about 124 million years. And this is where it is. It's also one of the first beaked birds that we have in the fossil record. It's known by thousands of individuals, so that is what's just amazing about Confuciusornis. And as you can see very clearly in these two specimens, it preserves wonderful skeletal material as well as plumage. So the feather-like structures are all preserved, and in this case here you can see these ornamental rectrices are also preserved. And this is interesting because in the deposit there are clearly two morphs identified, one with these long tail feathers and the other without. And of course, most people said that, these are all one species and this represents sexual dimorphism. But how do we know for sure? And when we actually began our study, I was interested to understand the growth dynamics of the specimen. And while I was studying these specimens, I also was very interested in bone tissues. As you know from my research, I'm interested in bone tissues. But looking at bone tissues, I knew that in modern birds, when they are ovulating, just before they lay their eggs, they develop very special tissue inside the marrow cavities of their bones. So inside the hollow cavities of their bones, they develop a tissue called medullary bone. And that tissue is what they use for helping to calcify the eggshells before they actually lay the eggs. So they don't take out calcium from their bones, they take the calcium from the special bone that is formed during ovulation. And while I was working on Confuciusornis, I came across one specimen, just one, that actually preserved medullary bone inside its medullary cavity. And these medullary bone was clearly attached to the endosteal margin of the bone, so to the inner margin of the bone, and they then clearly indicated that here we had females of the species. And so this was pretty cool. It got published in Nature in 2013 because it showed that we have a female bird. And since then, I've been looking at a number of different Confuciusornis specimens that actually are different size specimens, because we have this large range of different Confuciusornis specimens, and we were then able to select the female ones without tail feathers, which now we knew that because from our earlier study where we found the medullary bone in a Confuciusornis that didn't have those ornamental tail feathers, we knew that the ones without these ornamental feathers were female, and so we could clearly identify male and female. And we then were able to sample a whole lot of different ones from different ontogenetic sizes and get an idea about how long it took for them to grow up. And it looks, from their bone histology, it looks like they took about 5 years to reach an adult body size, or they could grow for up to 5 years, but many of them appear to reach adult body size by about 3 years already. And this indicates some amount of plasticity in their growth. And we've postulated that these birds obviously had interesting growth strategies, and that they were able to grow very fast, because we know from the bone tissues, here we have a cladogram again of birds with Archaeopteryx here and Confuciusornis right here. And if we look at the neornithines right here, we see that Confuciusornis has similar bone tissues. These are the different kinds of bone tissues. Confuciusornis has very similar bone tissues to the neornithines, which suggests that even as early as the Confuciusornis lineage, we see these evolution of rapid rates of growth that characterize modern birds. So summing up, we see that birds are maniraptoran dinosaurs. The evolution of birds and the origin of flight is decoupled. Okay, so flight and the evolution of birds is actually not as closely linked as previously thought. We also know that flight evolved multiple times among the maniraptoran dinosaurs, certainly more than 3 times. And what we understand is that the forelimb with feathered wings is quite a common feature among the Microraptoran dinosaurs, and we find forelimbs and hind limbs that form feathered wings as well, and we also get forelimbs with membranous wings. So flight is really something very special among the Microraptoran dinosaurs.